Before we begin today's story, I'd like to say a quick prayer for you, my dear family. May your days be filled with peace, your heart with joy, and your steps guided by light. Amen. If you're happy to be here, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across the grand ballroom of the Langston estate, their brilliance reflecting off polished marble floors. A string quartet played in the corner, their violins weaving together with the soft murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter from well-dressed guests. Waiters in starched white jackets floated seamlessly through the crowd with trays of champagne and caviar. It was the kind of evening where wealth did not just whisper. It shouted. Every gown shimmered, every cufflink sparkled, and the perfume of power hung heavier than the floral arrangements on the tables. And in the middle of it all, trying to make herself invisible, was Isabella Reyes. The maid's uniform clung uncomfortably to her slender frame. It seems already showing the wear of too many washes, too many long nights of labor. She adjusted the collar nervously as she balanced a tray of champagne flutes, moving carefully through clusters of guests. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, though a few loose strands framed her face, betraying her exhaustion. To the guests, she was no one, just another servant, a shadow in the background. But to Isabella, every second here was survival. Keep your back straight, don't stumble, and whatever you do, don't look them in the eye. Those were the rules whispered by the older maids when she'd first joined the Langston household. Tonight, she repeated them in her head like a prayer. Because tonight wasn't an ordinary gathering. Tonight, the Langstons, one of the most influential families in the city, were hosting a gala for business partners, politicians, and society's elite. And at the center of it all was the woman everyone called the Iron Lady, Margaret Langston. She stood near the grand staircase, adorned in an emerald gown that shimmered with every movement. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, but none shone brighter than the cold fire in her eyes. Her reputation was legend, sharp-tongued, proud, impossible to please. Servants feared her, guests respected her, and her only son, Alexander Langston, adored by society as the Golden Bachelor, was her prized possession. Isabella had heard the whispers. Margaret controlled everything in this house, from the menu to the guest list to the very path her son's future should take. No maid lasted long under her watchful gaze. And tonight, fate had placed Isabella directly in Margaret's line of sight. Careful with that, hissed Marjorie, another maid, as Isabella adjusted her tray before approaching a group of laughing men near the fireplace. Lady Langston is watching everyone tonight. One mistake, and she drew a finger across her throat. Isabella's stomach nodded. Taking a deep breath, Isabella forced her trembling hands to steady. The guests barely acknowledged her as she served them, their conversations flowing above her head about stock markets, political campaigns, and private yachts. She might as well have been furniture. But then it happened. A soft tear. The sound was quiet at first, almost lost beneath the music and laughter. But Isabella felt, before she heard it, the sudden pull at her side, fabric giving way. She froze, her eyes widening as she glanced down. Her uniform had snagged on the corner of a guest chair, ripping the seam dangerously close to her hip. Her heart stopped. No, not here, not tonight. She tried to shift to hide it, but before she could move, a sharp voice sliced through the room. What is this? The music seemed to dim. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. There, sweeping toward her like a storm in heels, was Margaret Langston herself. Isabella's throat went dry. She tried to curtsy to mumble an apology, but the older woman's eyes were already locked on the torn fabric. A disgrace, Margaret's voice rang out, sharp enough to cut glass. She reached forward without hesitation, her manicured fingers gripping the torn edge of Isabella's uniform. And in one swift, merciless motion, Ryup, The sound echoed through the ballroom. Guests gasped. Isabella stumbled back, her tray clattering to the floor, champagne spilling like liquid gold across the marble. Her cheeks burned with humiliation as she clutched at the torn uniform, her dignity unraveling in front of dozens of eyes. "Do you see?" Margaret announced, turning to the crowd with a cold smile. "This is what happens when we allow standards to slip. Even the staff cannot dress themselves properly." Laughter rippled among some of the guests. Others looked away uncomfortably, unwilling to intervene. Isabella's vision blurred with tears. Her lips trembled, but no words came. She felt small, smaller than she ever had in her life. A shadow crushed beneath the weight of Margaret Langston's cruelty. But before Margaret could speak again, a new voice cut through the silence. "Mother." The word was deep, commanding. The crowd parted as Alexander Langston stepped forward. Tall, broad-shouldered, his presence filled the space effortlessly. His black tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his dark hair swept back, his sharp jawline illuminated by the chandelier above. But it wasn't his looks that silenced the room. It was his eyes. They burned. Everyone had seen Alexander as charming, polite, the perfect heir. But tonight, his gaze held a storm that rivaled the one his mother had unleashed. Enough. His voice was calm, but every syllable carried authority. Margaret blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Alexander, I was simply..." "You humiliated her." His eyes didn't waver. They stayed fixed on his mother, in front of everyone. A murmur rippled through the guests. Margaret's smile faltered. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by her son. She's a servant. She represents this household. If she can't even keep her uniform intact, then the fault is not hers. Alexander's words cut clean, sharp. He stepped closer, his gaze softening only when it shifted to Isabella. "It is ours for treating people as if they are disposable." The room fell utterly silent. Isabella's breath caught. For the first time since the rip, she lifted her eyes and met his. There was no pity there, no condescension. Only something unexpected, something that made her heart race. Respect. And in that moment, the entire house watched in stunned silence as Alexander Langston, the millionaire heir, the man who had the world at his feet, slowly removed his tuxedo jacket. He stepped forward, placed it gently over Isabella's shoulders and whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. "No one tears at what belongs in this house, and no one tears at her again." Gasps filled the room. Margaret's face went pale. The guests exchanged shocked glances. And Isabella's world tilted. For a heartbeat after Alexander draped his jacket across Isabella's trembling shoulders, the grand ballroom stood frozen. The chandelier's light seemed harsher now, exposing every widened eye, every parted lip, every attempt by guests to mask their shock with polite smiles. It wasn't only that Alexander had spoken back to his mother. That in itself was newsworthy enough, but the tenderness with which he had treated the maid, a girl in a tattered uniform, was scandalous, unheard of. The Iron Lady had raised her son to embody perfection, to never let sentiment cloud judgment. And here, before half the city's elite, he had shattered that expectation. A brittle laugh broke the silence. "Chivalry, how quaint," murmured Senator Whitmore, adjusting his tie. His wife elbowed him sharply, but her eyes were glued to Isabella, who clutched the jacket like a lifeline. Near the bar, two society ladies leaned close, their whispers sharp as daggers. "Did you see the way he looked at her?" One hissed, her diamonds catching the light. As if she were, oh heavens, as if she were someone. "Margaret will never allow this. Never." Another guest, a businessman who owed his fortune to Langston contracts, shook his head slowly. "Mark my words, by morning, this girl will vanish from the household. Discretion is the currency here, and she's just bankrupted herself." But Isabella heard none of it. Her ears rang. Her pulse thundered in her veins. She could still feel the warmth of Alexander's jacket, the weight of his gesture pressing against her trembling body. What had just happened? A moment ago, she had been invisible, just another shadow in the Langston Empire. And now every pair of eyes in that glittering ballroom was fixed on her. On her. She wanted to disappear, to run, to hide in the narrow servants' quarters at the back of the mansion and bury her face in her pillow until morning. But her legs refused to move. Then Alexander turned to her again, his hand steady and sure, brushed against her arm as he whispered low enough that only she could hear. "You're safe. Don't be afraid." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The words caught in her throat, tangled with disbelief and something far more dangerous. Gratitude. Raw and aching. Margaret Langston, however, had not moved. Her emerald gown shimmered with each shallow breath as she stared at her son, her eyes wide with a fury she fought to contain. To explode here in front of senators, magnates, and foreign dignitaries would be to unravel her reputation. And Margaret never unraveled. Instead, she let her silence speak. Her lips curved into a smile so sharp it could slice glass. She lifted her champagne flute, clinked it lightly with the nearest guests, and murmured, "Shall we toast to Alexander's compassion?" Laughter, uneasy, forced, trickled through the room. The quartet resumed their music, bows scraping tentatively across strings. Conversation picked up again, though now in hushed tones, every sentence laced with speculation. The party continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The night's glitter had been tarnished not by scandal alone, but by something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Isabella managed to retreat toward the far edge of the ballroom, where shadows once again offered her cover. She pressed her back against the cool wall, her hands clutching Alexander's jacket. The faint scent of him lingered in the fabric, cedar, leather, something expensive yet grounded. Her heart would not stop racing. Why had he done it? Why had the heir to a fortune, the man every debutante dreamed of, defended a maid he barely knew? The answer terrified her, because in the flicker of his eyes and the softness of his voice, she had seen something she had promised herself never to believe in again. Kindness. Real, unguarded kindness. Across the room, Alexander remained by his mother's side, but anyone with eyes could see the tension radiating between them. Margaret's hand rested lightly on his arm, her nails digging into the fabric of his tuxedo with a force that belied her poised smile. Their exchange was wordless, but it screamed volumes. "You embarrassed me. You humiliated her. This ends tonight." "No, Mother. This begins tonight." By midnight, the last of the guests began to depart, their carriages and limousines waiting at the gates. The air outside carried the crisp chill of early spring, but inside, the mansion simmered with unspoken war. Margaret oversaw the farewells with perfect grace, her lips brushing cheeks, her laughter ringing clear. But her eyes never left Alexander, or the maid who lingered silently at the edge of the hall. When the final guest had gone, the grand doors closed with a thud that echoed through the cavernous foyer. The quartet packed away their instruments. The lights dimmed. The glittering illusion of the night faded, leaving only reality. And reality was heavy. "Alexander," Margaret said at last, her voice cutting through the emptiness. A word. The staff froze. Every servant knew what those words meant. They scattered quickly, eager to escape the storm brewing in the heart of the mansion. But Isabella, still clutching the jacket, found herself rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. Because Margaret's eyes had shifted, not only to her son, but to her. The great foyer, so alive with light and laughter an hour ago, now felt like a cathedral of silence. The chandeliers glimmered faintly above, but their warmth did not reach the cold marble beneath Isabella's feet. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, long and watchful. Alexander. Margaret's voice was calm, too calm. That measured tone was more dangerous than her shouts could ever be. It was the sound of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, inevitable and devastating. Her son turned slowly, meeting her gaze. The mask of the charming air had slipped. What remained was raw steel. His jaw was set, his dark eyes unwavering. "Mother," he replied evenly. "We'll talk in the study." Her brows arched. "No, darling. We'll talk here." Her hand flicked sharply, pointing toward Isabella, where she can hear it. Isabella's stomach dropped. Her knees weakened, and for a moment she considered fleeing. But something in Alexander's glance, a flicker of reassurance, a silent stay, rooted her to the marble floor. Margaret's heels clicked against the stone as she advanced. Each step was a sentence in a speech she hadn't yet spoken. She circled Isabella once, her emerald gown brushing against the maid's torn uniform like a blade against cloth. "Do you know what you've done, girl?" Margaret's voice was quiet, but it carried. "You have shamed this household in front of senators, investors, society's finest. And for what? A torn rag you call a uniform." Isabella's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, to apologize, but fear locked her voice away. "Mother," Alexander warned, his tone sharper now. Margaret ignored him, her eyes cold and gleaming, fixed on Isabella. "Do you think you belong here? Among crystal and silk? You are nothing more than a shadow in this house. And shadows know their place hidden." The words cut deep. Isabella's breath hitched. Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here. Not now." Alexander stepped forward, his voice rising, steady and unshakable. "Enough, Mother. This stops tonight." Margaret turned to him, her face a portrait of fury veiled in composure. "Stops? No, Alexander. It begins. You embarrassed me. You humiliated your family. Do you have any idea what they're saying about us right now?" "I don't care what they're saying," Alexander snapped, his voice reverberating through the vast hall. "What I care about is how you treated her." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Her? A maid? You dare to place a servant above your own mother?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Isabella's heart pounded so loudly she feared they could both hear it. Alexander's jaw tightened. His words came slow, deliberate, each one a blow struck against the fortress of his mother's pride. "Yes," he said. Margaret's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. The mask cracked for just a moment, revealing a fury so sharp it nearly shook the walls. "You will regret this," she whispered, her voice trembling not with weakness but with restrained power. "Both of you will." She spun on her heel, her gown trailing like a storm cloud as she ascended the marble staircase. Her footsteps echoed until they vanished into the upper floors, leaving only silence in her wake. Isabella sagged against the wall, clutching Alexander's jacket tighter around her. Her body trembled uncontrollably, but she forced herself to whisper, "You shouldn't have done that." Alexander turned to her, his expression softer now, though his eyes still burned with the afterglow of confrontation. "I couldn't stand by. Not tonight. Not ever again." Her gaze darted to the grand staircase, half expecting Margaret to descend again, armed with sharper words. "She'll destroy me," Isabella whispered. "You don't understand. She can make me disappear from this house with a single order. I'll never work again." Alexander stepped closer. His hand hovered near her arm, not quite touching, as if asking for permission. "Not while I'm here. Not while I have a say." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the chaos of the night faded. There was only him, his warmth, his steady presence, the shield he had become without her asking. "Why?" she breathed. The question tumbled out before she could stop it. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Alexander hesitated, his throat working as if words struggled to find their way out. Finally, he said, low and certain, because no one should ever be treated the way she treated you. And because his voice faltered softer now. Because I see you, Isabella. I see you. The words sank deep, unraveling the last thread of composure she had clung to. Her breath hitched. For years she had been invisible, a shadow in grand houses, a name forgotten the moment her shift ended. And now, for the first time, someone truly saw her. And that someone was Alexander Langston. Upstairs in the silence of her chamber, Margaret Langston stood at her window, her fingers clenched so tightly around her champagne glass that it splintered in her hand. Crimson drops slid down her palm, unnoticed. Her reflection in the glass revealed not defeat, but resolve. "This ends tonight," she whispered to herself, the words as sharp as the shards on the floor. "That girl will regret the day she ever stepped foot in this house." And in the dim light, the Iron Lady began to plan. Dawn broke gently over the Langston estate, painting the sprawling gardens in hues of pale gold. Dew clung to the roses like glass beads, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth and lingering champagne. But inside the mansion, the morning did not feel gentle. It felt sharp, uneasy, as though the house itself remembered the chaos of the night before. In the servants' quarters, whispers filled the cramped kitchen where maids gathered before the day's work began. The scent of fresh bread and strong coffee mingled with tension. "Did you see it?" Marjorie leaned close, her eyes wide with excitement. "The way Mr. Alexander put his jacket on her, in front of everyone." Another maid gasped, nearly spilling her tea. "You're lying." "I swear on my life," Marjorie insisted. The whole room saw it. Lady Langston ripped Isabella's dress to shreds, and he defended her, like some knight out of a storybook. The kitchen buzzed with speculation. "Maybe he's fond of her," one suggested in a hushed tone. "Fond? Don't be ridiculous. He's a millionaire. She's a maid. That's exactly why it's scandalous." Laughter, nervous and sharp, spilled into the room. But beneath it all, there was something else. Envy. Every girl in that kitchen had, at one point, wondered what it would be like to catch Alexander Langston's eye, to be noticed, to be chosen. And now one of their own had been, not in secret, but in the blaze of 100 watchful eyes. Isabella sat quietly in the corner, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the rip of fabric, the laughter of the guests, her own humiliation echoing in her ears. And then always his voice. "You're safe. Don't be afraid." The memory made her chest ache. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. Perhaps both. She could feel the other maid's stares on her, the way their whispers grew hushed whenever she shifted in her chair. She was no longer invisible, and she hated it. Upstairs in the Langstons' private breakfast room, Margaret sat perfectly composed, a porcelain teacup balanced between bloodless fingers. Across from her, Alexander sipped his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Do you realize," Margaret began smoothly, "that I received 3 calls before sunrise? One from Senator Whitmore's wife, one from Evelyn Cartwright, and one from dear Mrs. Rutherford, who never misses a chance to remind me of impropriety when she sniffs it." Alexander set his cup down. "Let them talk." Margaret's eyes glittered like daggers. "Oh, they will. But make no mistake, Alexander, gossip destroys. Reputations crumble in hours. And you handed them fuel last night." He leaned back in his chair, unbothered. "If their reputations are so fragile, that's their problem." Margaret's lips curved, though the smile never reached her eyes. "No, darling, it's yours. Because when they laugh, they're not laughing at me. They're laughing at you, and at this house. And I will not allow a maid," she spat the word like poison, "to unravel everything I've built." Alexander met her gaze without flinching. "You humiliated her in front of everyone. That's what they'll remember. Not me, not the house. You." The words hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's fingers tightened around her teacup until it threatened to crack. But she forced her voice into a calm, elegant tone. You will regret speaking to me that way, and she will regret stepping into a world that doesn't belong to her. Alexander's eyes darkened. If you're threatening her, threatening. Margaret laughed lightly, though it rang hollow. No, darling, I don't threaten. I simply remove obstacles. Cleanly. Permanently. Alexander's chair scraped against the floor as he stood, his voice low, but edged with warning. Try it, mother, and you'll lose me. For the first time, Margaret's composure faltered. Just slightly, enough for the silence to feel like victory. Alexander turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy against the marble. Margaret sat alone, her tea untouched, her mind racing. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the telephone on the side table. Her fingers dialed a number from memory. When the line clicked open, her voice was smooth as velvet. It's Margaret Langston. I need a discreet investigator. Someone who can find me everything there is to know about a girl named Isabella Reyes. Her smile returned as she set the phone back in its cradle. Let's see what shadows you're hiding in, little maid. Downstairs, Isabella slipped out of the kitchen, desperate for air. She stepped into the garden, where sunlight streamed across the fountains and birds sang in the hedges. She inhaled deeply, the morning chill stinging her lungs. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes and imagine a different life. One where her uniform wasn't torn, where she wasn't the subject of whispers, where she wasn't trapped between the wrath of the Iron Lady and the unexpected kindness of her son. But when she opened her eyes, Alexander was there, standing across the path, watching her quietly. Their gazes met, and for the first time, Isabella realized something dangerous. The storm was only just beginning. The city pulsed with its usual morning rhythm, car horns echoing down wide avenues, vendors shouting in the market square, and the distant hum of industry rising like a low heartbeat. On the 12th floor of a nondescript office building downtown, Margaret Langston sat across from a man who could have been mistaken for an accountant. He wore a gray suit, plain tie, and wire-rimmed glasses, but his eyes held the calculating sharpness of someone who never forgot a face or secret. Her name is Isabella Reyes, Margaret said, sliding a slip of paper across the desk. The name looked fragile in her elegant handwriting, but the intent behind it was iron. She works in my home. I want to know everything, where she comes from, who her family is, what debt she owes, what dirt she's tried to bury. Leave nothing untouched. The man adjusted his glasses. And if there's nothing to find, Margaret's smile was thin, glacial. There is always something to find. Everyone has shadows, especially those who pretend to be innocent. The man nodded, slipping the paper into his folder. You'll have my report in a week. No, Margaret's tone brooked no argument. 3 days. The investigator hesitated, then inclined his head. 3 days. As she rose to leave, Margaret paused at the door. Her reflection in the glass wall caught her eye, tall, poised, unbreakable. The Iron Lady. She touched the pearl at her throat, whispering to herself, You will not take my son from me, girl. Not while I breathe. Back at the Langston estate, Isabella carried a tray of fresh linens through the upstairs hall. Her steps were light, but her heart felt heavy. Whispers still trailed after her in the corridors. Servants curious, skeptical, envious. She tried to block them out, but their words clung like thorns. As she turned the corner, she nearly collided with Alexander. Careful, he said, steadying the tray with one hand. His touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through her veins. I'm sorry, sir, Isabella whispered, keeping her eyes low. Alexander frowned. We've been over this. No, sir, when it's just us. She hesitated, then lifted her gaze. His dark eyes were softer now than they had been in the glare of the party lights. Warm, searching. Alexander, she said, the name catching awkwardly in her throat. He smiled faintly, as though the sound of it pleased him more than it should. "Walk with me," he said. "But the linens, they can wait." They stepped out onto the eastern terrace, where the garden stretched endlessly under the morning sun. The air smelled of lavender and wet stone. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Isabella broke the silence. "You shouldn't have defended me last night." His brows furrowed. "You wanted me to stand there while she tore you apart?" "I wanted," she trailed off, struggling to find words. "I wanted to disappear. That's what I've always done when things get bad. Keep my head down. Stay invisible." Alexander studied her, his expression unreadable. And did it ever make the pain less? The question hit harder than she expected. Her throat tightened, and she shook her head. "No, that's why I did it," he said simply. "Because you shouldn't have to disappear. Not in my house." She looked away, blinking against the sudden sting of tears. "Not in my house." The words felt dangerous, almost intimate, like he was claiming responsibility for her in ways neither of them dared acknowledge. "You'll only make her hate me more," Isabella whispered. Alexander stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then, let her. I've lived my whole life under her control, Isabella. I won't let her control you too." Her heart raced. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the safety of his words, but the fear of Margaret's shadow loomed too large. Before she could reply, a sharp voice echoed across the terrace. "Alexander." Margaret stood at the doorway, her emerald gown replaced with a sharp black suit. Her eyes flicked to Isabella, then back to her son. "Mr. Carrington is here for your meeting," she said, her tone deceptively calm. "I trust you won't keep a man of his stature waiting." The unspoken warning laced every syllable. "Choose carefully where you spend your time." Alexander's jaw tightened. He gave Isabella one last lingering look before striding toward his mother. Isabella remained frozen on the terrace, the lavender-scented air suddenly stifling. She pressed her hands against the stone railing, trying to steady herself. But the thought gnawed at her, sharp and relentless. Margaret wasn't done with her, and whatever came next would be worse. The Langston mansion gleamed in the late afternoon light, but beneath its polished surface, unease simmered like an untended fire. Isabella moved through the dining room, carefully laying silverware across the long mahogany table. Each fork, knife, and spoon caught the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, shining with the kind of perfection Margaret Langston demanded. Isabella measured the distance between each piece twice, then stepped back to check the alignment again. The truth was, her hands were trembling. She hated that they trembled. From the far end of the room, Margaret watched silently. She had entered moments earlier without a sound, her presence as sharp and unsettling as a blade sliding from its sheath. "You missed a spot," Margaret said coolly. Isabella startled, glancing down. "I don't see you, ma'am." Margaret moved closer, her heels clicking against the floor. She stopped beside the table and pointed at a fork. "That one is angled half an inch too far outward." Sloppy. Heat flushed Isabella's cheeks. She corrected the placement quickly, murmuring an apology. Margaret studied her, lips curving into a faint, satisfied smile. "A Langston table is not a place for mediocrity. You'll learn that in time, or perhaps not." The words cut, as they were meant to, but Isabella lowered her head, swallowing her pride. This was no longer about simple mistakes. Margaret was probing, testing, looking for cracks she could widen. And Isabella knew it. Later in the servants' hall, whispers spread like wildfire again. "She made her polish the silver twice," Marjorie reported gleefully. "And then said it wasn't up to standard," another maid gasped. "She'll drive the poor girl mad before she's through." Isabella walked past them silently, ignoring the sting of their laughter. But deep inside, fear coiled tighter with every passing day. Margaret wasn't striking openly anymore. She was suffocating her slowly, with little humiliations designed to remind Isabella of her place. Meanwhile, across town, the investigator Margaret had hired moved like a shadow through old records and forgotten corners of the city. His name was Gerald Price, though few ever used it. People called him the Ledger, because he kept track of things no one else dared record. He sat in the dusty archives of City Hall, flipping through brittle files. The name Isabella Reyes appeared only in fragments. A birth certificate from a small county hospital, a school record cut short after her mother's death, a series of addresses scattered across working-class neighborhoods. But then something caught his eye, a sealed juvenile record. Interesting, he muttered to himself, tapping the folder. The record was marked confidential, which meant there was something worth hiding. Gerald leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. Well, Miss Reyes, what skeletons are you keeping in that closet of yours? At the mansion, Alexander was in his study, papers spread across his desk. But he wasn't reading them. His mind drifted again and again to Isabella. The way she had looked on the terrace, the quiet strength she tried so hard to hide. When the knock came at his door, he almost didn't hear it. Come in, he said absently. Isabella stepped inside, clutching a tray of tea. Her uniform was neat, her posture straight, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. I was told you hadn't eaten, she said softly, setting the tray down. Alexander looked up, his gaze locking with hers. For a moment, neither spoke. Isabella, he said finally, his voice lower than before. I don't want you to let her break you. Her lips parted slightly. She already is. The admission was raw, unguarded. Alexander rose from his chair and moved closer, his expression firm but gentle. Then let me be the one to put you back together. Her breath caught, and for the briefest second she almost believed he meant it not just as kindness, but as something more, something dangerous. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall. Isabella stepped back quickly, her hands folding in front of her. The fragile moment vanished as the study door opened. Margaret stood there, her gaze sweeping over the scene like a hawk's. Alexander, she said smoothly, though her eyes flicked to Isabella with quiet disdain. Mr. Carrington is waiting. Don't keep him. Alexander's jaw tightened. He turned to Isabella, his voice low. We'll finish this conversation later. As he left with his mother, Isabella stood alone in the study, her heart pounding. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere across the city, Gerald Price was already writing the first lines of her undoing. Gerald Price's office was a dim little room tucked behind a pawn shop, the kind of place where secrets changed hands more easily than money. A single lamp cast a cone of light over his desk, illuminating the folder spread open before him. Inside lay the threads of Isabella Reyes's life, threads Gerald had patiently pulled together. A birth certificate, sparse school records, a mother who died young, a father whose name was never listed. Years of scraping survival from one address to another. Nothing unusual for a girl from the working class. But the juvenile record, that was different. Gerald had called in a favor at the courthouse, slipping a clerk $50 to misplace a lockbox key. The file he held now was stamped confidential. Do not release without court order. He flipped it open. At 15, Isabella Reyes had been arrested. The charge, theft. A department store downtown. A dress worth barely more than a week's wages. The report noted she had pleaded guilty, confessed in tears, and was released into the custody of her ailing mother. The record had been sealed after her mother's death, likely forgotten by everyone but the law. Gerald leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. Well, even the saints have stains. He tapped the file once, then slipped it into a manila envelope marked with Margaret Langston's name. At the Langston estate, Margaret was already entertaining. A cluster of ladies sat in the grand salon, sipping tea and exchanging gossip that glittered sharper than the diamonds at their throats. Isabella moved quietly among them, refilling cups, offering pastries. Her head bowed low. "She's pretty, isn't she?" murmured one guest, watching Isabella's figure retreat across the room. "Too pretty for a servant." Margaret's smile tightened. "Pretty doesn't last. Character does." The other women chuckled, assuming it was just another of Margaret's cold aphorisms. But Isabella felt the words like a slap. She kept moving, pretending not to hear, though her hands trembled on the silver tray. At the far side of the room, Alexander appeared in the doorway. His gaze landed on Isabella instantly. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them. His silent encouragement, her fragile endurance. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. Her eyes narrowed. "Patience," she told herself. "Let the trap close first. Then you can spring it." That evening, as the guests departed and the house quieted, Alexander found Isabella in the library. She was shelving books, her movements careful, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. "You shouldn't let her cut you down like that," Alexander said softly, stepping closer. Isabella looked up, startled. "You heard?" "I always hear," he said, "and I see more than she thinks I do." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to lean on him, but fear pressed too close. "It doesn't matter what she says. It only matters what she can do." "And what if I don't let her do it?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Isabella's lips parted, but she had no answer. The silence stretched, charged with something both terrifying and electric. Then footsteps echoed in the hall. Margaret's voice drifted closer, smooth and commanding. Isabella stepped back quickly, retreating into the shadows between the shelves. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he didn't call her out. Margaret entered a moment later, a sealed envelope in her hand. She set it on the table, her eyes meeting her son's. "We need to talk," she said. Alexander glanced at the envelope, then back at her. The weight of her tone left no room for refusal. From the shadows, Isabella's heart pounded. Something told her that envelope, whatever it contained, would change everything. The dining room of the Langston estate was ablaze with light. A dozen crystal chandeliers poured their brilliance over the long table, where Margaret had gathered her closest friends and a few influential associates for an intimate supper. It was not unusual for Margaret to host such dinners. What was unusual was the tension thrumming beneath the polished surface. Isabella moved carefully between the guests, serving dishes with practiced grace. But she could feel it, the weight of Margaret's gaze, the hush of something unsaid hanging in the air like a storm about to break. At the head of the table, Margaret smiled serenely, the sealed envelope resting beside her wine glass. She had yet to open it in public, but the fact of its presence was deliberate, bait in plain sight. Alexander, seated at her right, kept glancing at it with narrowed eyes. He knew his mother too well. This was no simple letter. This was a weapon. "Isabella," Margaret said suddenly, her voice slicing through the gentle hum of conversation. Isabella froze, then turned toward her. "Yes, ma'am." "Come closer." Every head at the table turned as Isabella obeyed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Margaret tapped the envelope with one manicured finger. "Do you know what this is?" Isabella shook her head slowly. "No, ma'am." Margaret's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "It is your past, and I believe it belongs in the open." She slit the envelope with a silver letter opener and withdrew several folded papers. The rustle of them seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the room. "Margaret," Alexander began, his voice taut, but his mother silenced him with a look. Then she began to read. Juvenile record. Isabella Reyes. Arrested at 15 for theft. A department store dress. Released to her mother's custody. The words fell like stones into a pond. each one rippling outward through the room. Gasps broke from the guests. Forks clattered against plates. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to tilt, the polished dining room spinning around her. Margaret set the papers down with deliberate calm. This is the girl my son has allowed into our home. A thief, a liar, a common criminal dressed in servant's cloth. The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella's hands trembled at her sides. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her shame, that old buried wound, had been dragged into the light, raw and exposed. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's enough. Margaret's eyes flashed. You defend her? After this? Yes, Alexander said, his voice like iron. I defend her because she was a child, because she paid for her mistake, and because none of this gives you the right to humiliate her like this. The guests shifted uncomfortably, whispering behind their hands. No one had ever heard Alexander speak to his mother this way. Margaret rose as well, her posture regal, unyielding. You are blind, Alexander. She is beneath you, and the more you cling to her, the more she will drag you down. Isabella finally found her voice, though it was soft, trembling. I never lied to you, she said, her eyes on Alexander. I wanted to forget it, but I never lied. Her words pierced him more deeply than Margaret's accusations. He stepped closer, his gaze locking with hers. I believe you. Margaret's expression hardened, fury flashing in her eyes. But for the first time in her reign over this house, she felt something shift. The authority she wielded like a scepter had cracked, and her son was no longer entirely under her command. Isabella, however, could not feel triumph. She felt only the heat of humiliation, the weight of every stare upon her. With tears burning her eyes, she turned and fled from the dining room, her footsteps echoing through the silent house. Alexander made to follow, but Margaret's voice rang out behind him. If you go after her, Alexander, you will regret it. That girl will ruin everything you have built. He paused at the threshold, his back rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without a word, he stepped into the hall, leaving his mother and her guests in stunned silence. Isabella fled down the long corridor, her breath breaking into sobs she could no longer contain. The glittering chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the portraits of Langston ancestors staring down at her, all of it blurred through the sheen of tears. She pushed open the door to the servants' wing and slipped inside, shutting it behind her with trembling hands. The world here was dimmer, quieter, stripped of the grandeur of the main house. For once, she welcomed the plain walls, the narrow halls. They felt honest, unlike the glittering cruelty she had just endured. Her small room waited at the end of the hall, no larger than a closet, with a single bed pressed against the wall and a wooden chest at its foot. Isabella sank onto the mattress, pressing her face into her hands. It was over. She had known, deep down, that Margaret Langston would never allow her peace. But to have her shame paraded before guests, to be stripped of her dignity so mercilessly, it was more than she had prepared her heart to endure. The dress, that foolish, beautiful dress. She had been 15, desperate, standing in a department store window with her mother. Her mother had coughed into a handkerchief, her body already failing from illness, while Isabella had stared at the gown shimmering beneath the glass. She hadn't stolen it for herself. She had stolen it to see her mother smile. Just once. But none of that mattered now. The only thing anyone heard was thief. A knock at the door startled her. Isabella wiped her face quickly, though her eyes were still red. Please leave me alone, she whispered. The knock came again, firmer this time. Then his voice. Isabella. Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him to go, to spare herself the deeper pain of hearing his pity. But her silence betrayed her, and within moments the door opened. Alexander stepped inside, closing it softly behind him, in the dim light of her small lamp. His presence seemed almost too large for the modest room. He didn't speak at first, only looked at her, the streaks of tears on her cheeks, the exhaustion in her posture. Finally he said, "I'm sorry." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "Why should you be sorry? It's the truth. Your mother only revealed what I tried so hard to bury. She revealed it like a weapon," he countered, his voice sharp. "There's a difference." Isabella shook her head, her fingers twisting in her lap. "It doesn't matter. To her, to your friends, to this entire house. I will always be the maid who once stole a dress. That will never change." Alexander stepped closer, lowering himself to one knee before her. It startled her, this powerful man kneeling in a servant's quarters, his eyes level with hers. "It matters to me," he said softly, "because I see you, Isabella, not the mistake. You." Her throat tightened, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. "You'll regret saying that," she whispered. "She'll make sure of it. She'll destroy me, and she'll hurt you in the process." "Let her try," Alexander said, his jaw set. "I've lived my entire life under her shadow. But tonight, for the first time, I realized something." He paused, searching her face. "That shadow doesn't own me anymore." Isabella's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to lean into the warmth in his eyes, the promise in his words. But fear still coiled tight within her. "I can't cost you everything," she murmured. He reached for her hand, his touch steady, grounding. "You're not costing me anything, Isabella. You're the first thing that's ever felt real." Her tears spilled anew, but this time they were not only of sorrow, they were of release, of finally being seen, not as a servant, not as a mistake, but as a woman whose worth had never depended on the cruelty of others. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the world outside her small room forgotten. Then almost imperceptibly, Isabella leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. And in that fragile closeness, something shifted, something that neither Margaret's scorn nor society's judgment could easily undo. The Langston estate had never felt more divided. The morning after the dinner scandal, the household buzzed with whispers. Servants moved through the halls, carrying trays and linens, but their conversations always drifted back to the same subject: Isabella Reyes. Some pitied her. Others said Margaret had been right to expose her. A few, emboldened by the matriarch's cruelty, treated Isabella with thinly veiled disdain, as if her past now granted them permission to look down on her. Isabella bore it in silence. She worked with the same diligence as always, but her movements were quieter, her presence more withdrawn. The echo of Margaret's voice still haunted her, a thief, a liar, a common criminal. She found refuge only in the moments when Alexander sought her out. He did not care for the whispers or the lingering stares. He walked with her openly, spoke to her as though she were his equal. And though Isabella warned him to be careful, his defiance only seemed to grow. Margaret, however, was not idle. In her private parlor, she sat with Gerald, her most loyal adviser. The curtains were drawn, the air thick with the scent of burning incense. She held a glass of brandy, the amber liquid catching the low light. "You've done well uncovering her past," she said coldly. "But it's not enough." Gerald inclined his head. "What more would you have me do, ma'am?" Margaret's eyes gleamed, sharp as glass. "I want her gone. Not just humiliated, removed. She must have no place here, not in this house, not in my son's life. Do you understand?" Gerald hesitated. "Forgive me, but Alexander is not a man easily swayed. If we force her out, he may rebel further." Margaret's grip on the glass tightened. "Then we do not force her. We make it impossible for her to stay. We remind her of her place until she chooses to leave on her own." She set the glass down, with a deliberate clink. Do whatever it takes. Just be discreet. That evening, Isabella stood in the garden seeking solitude. The air was cool, scented with roses and damp earth. Above, the sky was a canvas of deep indigo scattered with stars. She leaned against the stone railing of the terrace, her mind heavy. She had almost convinced herself to leave, to pack her things and vanish before Margaret's campaign against her grew unbearable. But she hadn't, not yet, because of him, Isabella. The sound of his voice behind her drew her from her thoughts. She turned to see Alexander stepping into the moonlight, his dark suit stark against the pale marble. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said softly. "The whole house feels hostile tonight." "I don't need protecting," she replied, though her voice wavered. He came closer, his gaze steady on hers. "Maybe not, but I need to be here." For a moment, silence stretched between them. The night hummed with unspoken things. Isabella finally exhaled, her words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't know how much longer I can stay, Alexander. Every day, it feels like I'm drowning in your mother's contempt. She'll never stop, and I can't." Her voice broke. "I can't be the reason she turns against you." He stepped closer, closing the space between them until she could feel the warmth of him, the steadiness of his presence. "Listen to me," he said, his tone firm, unyielding. "You are not the reason for her cruelty. She is. She has spent her life controlling everything and everyone around her. But I won't let her control this. Not us." Isabella blinked back tears. "You say that now, but what happens when she forces you to choose?" "I already have." His voice was low and tense. "And I choose you." The words hung in the air, raw and dangerous. Isabella felt her heart stutter in her chest. "You don't mean that," she whispered, trembling. "You can't." But before she could finish, Alexander reached for her hand, pulling it gently to his chest. She could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I do," he said. "You're the only thing that feels real to me, Isabella. The only thing I want that isn't about power or money or my mother's approval. For once in my life, I want something for me." The dam inside her broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head, torn between fear and longing. "You'll regret this. One day you'll regret me." "I won't," he murmured. His hand brushed against her cheek, wiping away her tears with a tenderness that made her knees weaken. "Because you've given me something she never could. You've given me truth." For the first time, Isabella didn't pull away. She let herself lean into him, let herself believe, just for this fragile moment, that what they had could survive the storm surrounding them. And as the moon bathed the garden in silver light, Alexander bent his head, and his lips met hers in a kiss that was both fierce and gentle, desperate and reverent. A kiss that bound them together, even as the world threatened to tear them apart. But high above them, in the shadow of an upstairs window, Margaret watched. Her fingers tightened on the lace curtain, her eyes narrowing. So this was how far her son had fallen. Very well. If Alexander would not sever this attachment, then she would do it for him, no matter the cost. The Langston estate buzzed with anticipation. Margaret had organized another gathering, a weekend brunch for the city's most influential figures. Politicians, philanthropists, business magnates, all assembled under the glittering chandeliers. But beneath the polished civility, there is tension. Everyone had heard whispers of the last dinner, of Margaret's public humiliation of the maid, of Alexander's quiet defiance. And everyone waited to see what would happen next. Isabella moved like a ghost through the hallways. Her duties multiplied under Margaret's orders. Trays to polish, linens to fold, silverware to arrange. Gerald barked instructions at her, thinly veiled mockery dripping from every command. Her hands trembled as she balanced a tray of crystal flutes, her body weary, her spirit raw. Still, she endured, because of Alexander. But Margaret had saved her cruelest blow for this day. The brunch was in full swing when it happened. Guests laughed and clinked glasses. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Margaret stood at the head of the long table, her poise impeccable, her smile sharp. And then, with deliberate calm, she rose. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying with practiced elegance, "I thank you all for gracing my home once again. Today is not just a celebration of friendship and influence. It is also a moment for clarity." A hush fell over the room. Isabella froze near the doorway, a tray in her hands. Alexander, seated midway down the table, felt unease coil in his chest. Margaret's gaze cut through the guests and landed on Isabella. "Clarity about this woman," she said, her voice laced with venom. "The so-called maid who parades through my halls as though she belongs." Gasps rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to Isabella. Margaret lifted a delicate piece of fabric from the table. Isabella's uniform apron neatly folded. With a swift motion, she tore it down the middle. The sound of ripping cloth echoed like thunder. "This," Margaret declared, holding the tattered fabric high, "is what she is. Torn, stained. Beneath the surface of obedience lies theft, deceit, and ambition far beyond her station. She seeks to ensnare my son, to drag the Langston name into scandal and ruin." The crowd murmured, some shocked, some enthralled by the spectacle. Isabella's face flushed crimson, her hands trembling as tears burned behind her eyes. She wanted to run, to vanish, but her feet would not move. Margaret pressed her advantage, her voice rising. "Shall we allow a criminal maid to rise among us? Shall we reward deceit with acceptance?" The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes shifted to Alexander. This was the moment Margaret had crafted. The trap sprung. If he stayed silent, Isabella would be destroyed. If he spoke, he would defy his mother publicly, with all of society watching. Alexander rose, slowly, deliberately. The murmurs swelled. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with fire. He stepped away from the table, moving toward Isabella. Every gaze in the room followed him. When he reached her side, he took the torn apron from Margaret's hand and let it fall to the marble floor. The gesture was quiet, but it thundered through the silence. Then, without hesitation, he placed his arm firmly around Isabella's shoulders. "She is not torn," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "She is not deceit. She is not shame. She is the only honest soul in this house." Gasps erupted. Margaret's face drained of color. Alexander turned, addressing the guests directly. "You all came here today to admire my family's wealth, our power, our influence. But what is that worth when it is built on cruelty, on control, on fear?" The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others leaned forward, riveted. "I will not let her be destroyed for my mother's pride," Alexander continued. "I will not let her be torn apart because she dares to be more than her past. If loving her means defying the expectations of this house, of this society, then so be it." He pulled Isabella closer, his arm tightening protectively. "She is mine and I am hers. And nothing, not even you, Mother, can change that." The room erupted into chaos. Some guests applauded. Others whispered furiously. Margaret staggered back, her hand pressed to her chest, her composure shattering for the first time in years. Isabella, trembling in Alexander's embrace, felt tears spill down her cheeks. But this time they were not from shame. They were from awe. The house, once united in Margaret's iron grip, stood witness to something it had never seen before. Alexander Langston choosing not power, not approval, but love. And in that moment, as silence settled once more, the entire estate knew nothing would ever be the same.